Here's the thing. A lot of booktube videos out there would make you believe that annotating your books is not only necessary, but also a proof that you're engaging with your books deeply. And I dare to disagree. Hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. I want to preempt this video by saying that this is not anti-annotating video. If you love annotating and this is your way of engaging with the book, go for it. But I recently watched a video where that particular booktuber said that she cannot use libraries because she has to annotate in her books. And it kind of made me think, what about all the people who cannot afford to buy books and they heavily rely on libraries? Does it mean that they're not a proper reader because they cannot annotate their books? Of course not. If you've been on this channel, you know that I absolutely love libraries. I want to encourage everyone to use libraries more, and lots of the books I talk about come from libraries. And also, as someone who has never really annotated her books, and I'll explain in a minute why, I thought this video might be helpful to some of you who cannot but also maybe don't want to write in their books. I'm talking about fiction books. I'm not talking about books that you are reading for your studies or for your job. Obviously, that's a completely different category and a much more scientific approach may need to be taken. And the reasons behind not wanting to write in your books are multiple. You maybe have special editions that you don't want to damage. Maybe you're sharing your books with your family members like I do, and there's nothing worse than picking up a book that is super heavily annotated by someone else. Another reason could be that you yourself want to reread the same books in the future without any bias. I mean, maybe some of you would go and buy another copy at that point. I don't see myself doing that, and I think most of us probably wouldn't do that. And finally, the reason that applies to me is that I just cannot, for the life of me, bring myself to write in a book because it's an old habit of mine. I grew up in a family where we never had books because we had no money to buy books, and even later when I was at university, neither I nor any of my colleague students had their own books, and so we were very much used to using research libraries, sitting over a library copy book and then writing in our own notebooks. And this has become a lifelong habit for me, and even now when I can afford to buy books and I do own some books, I still do not write inside them. And so I thought it would be useful to do a video on how I approach deep reading with my own methods that do not involve writing within a book. My rule number one, and this is where I risk sounding like a dinosaur, I use a paper notebook and a pen to record my thoughts on a book. I know, it sounds very old-fashioned, but hear me out. Yes, of course, you can use various apps on your phone or on your PC to type your notes, but I want to encourage you to try a physical journal because there's something more personal about putting down on paper your reflections about book. It makes your brain engage in a different way. You will remember those books better, and also, let's face it, we spend so much time on screens. The last thing we need is another app, and you can think of it like a very good mental health exercise. Writing itself is very good for your mental well-being. So I highly encourage you, get yourself a pretty notebook if that's what's gonna get you going, or a nice pen. I recently got back into using fountain pens, which I am absolutely obsessed with, and whenever I pick up my fountain pen, it just makes me want to write. So whatever will get you going, use it, buy it, and start writing. Now, I did a video about my notebook ecosystem where I was showing this reading journal. I'll link it above if you want to see it in more detail, but basically I just keep a table of content in the beginning of my reading journal where I put down all the titles of all the books that I've read, which makes it very easy to see at a glance. And then I dedicate about 1 page per book, but honestly, it varies. And I will share some tips in a minute for when you cannot always carry the reading journal with you. I certainly don't always carry this big book with me. But one of the things you may want to consider is using one of those leather notebook covers into which you can stick a couple of notebooks. So you could have your normal notebook for your productivity, for example, that you carry with you every day, and then in there you could stick a little reading journal as well, and that way you will always have it with you. Now, this second tip is probably the most important. I can't stress how important it is. Use your own words. Try to formulate your own opinions. Argue with the book. Criticize it. Ask questions. Don't write what the plot is about, because when you in the future want to go back to your notes on a relevant book, you don't want to be reading about a plot. Even if you forget the plot, you can always get it with a little bit of a help from Google. And this is where I think sometimes annotating in itself is not going to bring you as much value. And I guess this is why some people do both. They annotate the books heavily, but then at the end, when they finish the book, they still write in their reading journal. Because, for example, underlining in itself is not really engaging with the text, in my opinion, because you're merely underlining, as in highlighting the bits that are interesting to you, but it doesn't explain why you're interested in that particular text or what you're thinking about it. My next tip is, unless the book is very, very long, I would suggest you don't write in your reading journal until you've finished the book, because just like with annotating, underlining, and putting lots of tabs in your book, it can distract from a reading experience. You can always go back and read the same book again, but when you're reading your book, especially for the first time, you want to enjoy that experience. You want to be in the flow. Right now I'm reading War and Peace, obviously 1,300 pages. There is a high risk I am going to forget lots of thoughts I have while I'm reading the book. So that is an exception. But for the majority of the books, I usually write about my impressions after I have finished a book. And you may ask, well, what if I forget something? I don't want you to worry about it. Remember, these are fiction books. You're reading for pleasure, and the most important things will prevail. In other words, you will still feel whatever you're feeling when you finish the book, right? And so these thoughts are the most important. Okay, next tip is for when you cannot always carry your reading journal with you, which is probably for most of us most of the time. First of all, you can use whatever notebook you have in your hand to write in the notes on the book that you're reading, and then just tear that page and glue it onto your reading journal later. This is what I did, for example, with The Details by Ia Genberg, the book I read while I was on holiday and I didn't have my reading journal. You can see these yellow pages attached with a sellotape onto my reading journal after I returned from a holiday. Another thing you could do is simply use post-it notes. Top tip, to always have post-it notes with you. Use a bunch of them as a bookmark, and that way you will always have something to mark your pages with. By the way, can we just take a second to admire this absolutely stunning cover? This is Little Boy Lost by Marghanita Laski, a book I'm reading currently. I am loving it so far. This is by Persephone Books, and this is a little bit of a different edition than you would normally see from Persephone Books, which tend to be just plain grey. I adore this cover. Anyway, so for example, in here I saw an interesting word that I've never heard before. I'm going to use it for my word of the month. If you don't know what it is, you need to watch one of my monthly reading wrap-ups. So I simply just took one of the post-it notes from this stack that I use as bookmark, and I would just put it under that word while a little bit of the post-it note still sticking out from the page so you can see it here. And then a little bit later, for example, I had a paragraph where I thought was an interesting description of a society post WW2. And so again, I would just attach the post-it note right under that relevant line. That's it. You don't need to write in there. You don't need 100 highlighters. You don't need fancy plastic tabs. Of course, if you want, you can use a pencil if you carry a pencil with you to write on the pages, and then you can rub it out. If it's a library book, please don't be one of those people who return their library books without rubbing out their handwritten notes. No, 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 that's very naughty. So yes, you can use a pencil if you want to mark where your relevant paragraph that you're interested in starts and where it ends with a little cross. You can even write your words. As long as you rub them out, you can even go further and actually write on the post-it note itself. And the beauty of that is that afterwards you can, of course, if it's a very long sentence especially, you can just rip it out and stick it under the relevant title in your reading journal, so you don't even have to rewrite it again. You would need to use a sellotape probably because you don't want your post-it notes to fall off. It all depends how intricate and in-depth your descriptions are, because don't forget, really, we're using this journal to enter into a relationship with the book a little bit and argue with it. So it may not be sufficient if you just put down here on the post-it note, oh, an interesting word. That's probably not enough to stick something like this in this journal, but maybe you had a deeper thought on a story or on a specific paragraph in that particular book, and you may just want to include it in your reading journal. Now, I do need to confess that I actually do use these plastic tabs that you can get on Amazon just because they do stick better, and I use them exactly in the same way as I have just shown you with the post-it notes. So I'm also reading Stoner at the moment, and again, I would just place this tab right under the paragraph or a line that I thought was interesting, and then I would go back to it once I finished the book. Some people color code these tabs. So for example, you could have green for interesting quotes, and then yellow for narration, and another color maybe for interesting character descriptions. But I don't do that because I'm a strong believer that the simpler your system is, the more likely you are going to maintain it. So I just use whatever colors I have, and when I go back to that passage, I will immediately remember why I marked it by just looking at it. I would love for this video to open a bit of a discussion, and I would love to hear from you about what you do, because you know there isn't one right way to be a reader, and at the end of the day we all find methods that work for us best. I guess what matters most is that the books that we've read stay with us in one way or another, and that can be through a written note, or maybe highlighted passage, or maybe just a memory of how they made you feel, because some of you maybe just want to read a book, enjoy it, and then put it back on the shelf. Whatever your approach is, I would love to hear about it. Let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next week as always. Bye for now.